I'm really looking forward to see what else we have in store for the rest of today and tomorrow. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. One was not able to join us, so it was pre-recorded as a video. I'm speaking about our first keynote speaker, the Honorable Sherri Goodman. Sherri Goodman is Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She is the chair of the board at the Council of Strategic Risks, where we met. She is a senior strategist and advisory board member at the Center for Climate and Security, and she is a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. Sherri Goodman didn't have her schedule permit her to join us today. She'll be sharing her thoughts through this video that we are going to play next for you. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sherri. As I've just teed you up, you truly have had one of the most incredible careers out of anyone I know here in Washington, D.C. and globally. You are really known as the godmother of climate and security, and there couldn't be a more perfect person to discuss what this really means for us as a collective populace. We share this one planet, and we are doing a lot of damage to it. And there's some real serious implications for our collective human security. Can you please talk to this audience today a little bit about what this means if we don't reduce our carbon emissions? What are the implications for our collective human security? Please share with us your incredible knowledge and depth.
Well, thank you, Shweta. It's a pleasure to be here with you and the audience today. I think, as everyone well knows today, climate change acts as a threat multiplier for everything we experience in society. This is a phrase we coined back 15 years ago now, when the first military advisory board I founded focused on the threat of climate change to national security. But it's much broader than that now, and as we know. And the threat multipliers of climate are what we are experiencing now, with the dangerous rise in temperatures, heat extremes around the planet, most notably in the Arctic, but we'll come back to that, wildfire risks, dramatic sea level rise, coastal and riverine flooding around the world, drought, persistent drought across much of the equatorial lands, and even in temperate climates. Much of the US is experiencing historic drought right now, and permafrost collapse and thaw, and changing ocean conditions. Those are just some of the threat multipliers that we are now experiencing, compounded with extreme weather events, more intense tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and storms on a regular basis, as the climate has changed globally and locally as we experience. So what does that mean? It means that every sector of society is affected, from farmers who can no longer grow the crops, traditional crops, because there's either too little water, too much water, too high temperatures, or a polar vortex. Supply chains being disrupted around the world, military forces having to come now much more to the aid for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief after storms, wildfires, and floods, evict people from their homes, damage their communities, and in some cases lead to even worse conditions. So we're seeing military forces brought in as backup to first responders in many cases, and this is just changing the whole way our society is operating today. And that's where we really need to open our eyes to these risks, and then figure out how we move forward.
Really recognize that these aren't necessarily how we've always described them, as environmental, strictly just something that environmentalists care about, but this is something that the national security community in the United States and more globally really cares about and is coming together on. And it's something that, with the new administration coming in, has really prioritized and made a major national security priority, climate change, but that's not new for the defense communities. So talk to us a little bit about that. What has the defense communities already known, and what are the kind of alliances now that are being forged going forward to recognize everything that you just described as a real threat to our collective human security?
Well, yes, you're right. The defense and national security community has recognized this for several decades already. You know, when I served in the Department of Defense in the 1990s, first it was seen as, when I first came in, as an environmental laggard for needing to clean up military bases and comply with environmental laws. But within less than a decade, it really became known as an environmental leader, and still is today, and clean energy leader. And today, the military under the leadership, the US military under the leadership of President Biden, Vice President Harris, and now Secretary of Defense Austin, is integrating climate into everything it does. And as Secretary Austin has said, climate change affects virtually every aspect of our military, and it's a security risk that we need to pay attention to. So now there's climate risk analysis and assessments of military installations and efforts to reduce energy use, to bring down the emissions footprint and move us onto cleaner fuels and a lighter carbon footprint. So across the board, and then in the intelligence community, the same thing, recognizing that how we understand every aspect of the world is being affected by changing climate and atmospheric conditions.
That's right. And this is actually amplifying existing threats. So it's not that we're saying climate change is operating in an isolation. It's actually the undercurrent behind existing tensions that are just intensifying. And that is a term you've coined, threat multiplier. And we hear it now broadly in the climate and security discourse. So let's tease that out just a little bit. What do we mean exactly by threat amplifier? And why is this something that the average American should be concerned about?
Well, because it's worsening all conditions in society. Today, we live in a world where we have the greatest wave of global migration since World War II. And increasingly, the people migrating and who are displaced because of climate conditions, because they can't grow their crops, or they don't have enough water, or they have too much water and they're flooded out, or the sea level is rising around their small island nation. And in Africa, you know, we often see particularly an overlap between what we call state fragility, countries that are at risk because of either a combination of poor governance, corruption, and also climate conditions. So there's a direct connection between loss of water and food security, and then terrorists who seek to take advantage of vulnerable populations, because when their people don't have enough food or water to take care of their families, they need to flee. And we saw that very directly in Syria, the prolonged drought that preceded the deadliest conflict of modern times, that forced farmers and herders to flee towards the urban areas, that created unrest that was then taken advantage of by extremist forces, was provoked in part by changing climate conditions. So we've got the state fragility on top of climate risk. Then we've got areas of the world where we have emerging geopolitical competition because of the changing climate. And the Arctic is really exhibit A in that case, where because of retreating sea ice, warming temperatures, and collapsing permafrost, you've got a whole new ocean that's opened in the last several decades. The Arctic is expected to be ice-free for 6 to 7 months of the year within the next decade to decade and a half.
Wow.
And that will open up the northern sea route along Russia's coastline as potentially a toll road for transit from ports in Asia to ports in Europe, and changing fish stocks, increasing infrastructure, but also infrastructure collapsing on the permafrost. And you know, we also, fossil fuels are very available under the deep seabed. And so more ironically, changing climate conditions could lead to further extraction of fossil fuels. So we have to really pay attention to this, to these changing conditions, and begin to reduce the risks to people around the world. Human security is really at the core of it. And now we have the opportunity to climate proof our institutions and our infrastructure.
Well, thank you so much for explaining that as clearly as you just did for our audience. This isn't a problem that is over there or someone else's or far in the future. It's actually something that's impacting every single person, especially as it comes down to our national and individual security. And thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for joining us briefly for this conference. We hope to have you in person next time, but we appreciate your thoughts. Thank you very much, Sherri Goodman.
Thank you, Shweta. Pleasure to be with you.
Okay, so that was a pre-recorded session that we had with Sherri. So unfortunately, she is not able to join us here today, but provided us with really interesting, relevant information for this conference and for our Q&A at the end of this session. So please note to submit your Q&A into the chat, and we will get to it as soon as we are finished with our speakers. But Sherri is not here, so any questions that you have for her, we will collect and we can hopefully address in some other format. And just a reminder, we are operating under the hashtag #ClimateSAN. So please do share this widely. The information Sherri just provided is obviously information we need widely disseminated. So please do use the hashtag and share with your networks. So with no further ado, I am very excited to introduce our next speaker, Mr. James Grabert. Mr. Grabert has worked for the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, UNFCCC, for more than 25 years. He currently heads the Mitigation Division of the UNFCCC, leading the work from market-based approaches to climate change mitigation. In addition, he also currently leads the Secretariat's Communication and Engagement Division. He is based in Bonn, Germany. He is joining us today to speak about the urgent need for action on climate change. So welcome, Mr. Grabert. Mr. Grabert will highlight now the response to COVID-19 and what we've learned for when conservatives and progressive leaders agree on what needs to be done to combat a global threat. And we can see from his remarks that substantial action can occur really quickly. We're excited to get into it. It's all yours, Mr. Grabert.
Thank you so much to the organizers for having me here today at this conference on the impacts of climate change and human security. Let me start by saying that climate change is already a security issue affecting the world, one that will only increase over time if we don't act. The interlinkages between climate change it's already a security issue affecting the world today. So these interlinkages between climate change and security are multidimensional and complex, of course. Climate change is the threat multiplier, as we've heard. It worsens our social, economic, and environmental pressures, leading to social upheaval and possibly even violent conflicts. Impacts of climate change on security may include intensified competition for food, water, energy, and other resources in regions where resources are already stretched to the limit due to droughts, crop failure. It's also about the livelihood insecurity and migration on an unprecedented scale caused by extreme weather events and diseases, and risk related to volatile food prices, food provision, job markets, geopolitical instability and inequality at the more complex level of human systems. So this is all what we're seeing in terms of impacts. Therefore, I believe the climate change narrative must go beyond these impacts on natural resources and must be carried forward to show that communities become more distressed, more exposed, more accessible. People are being displaced due to these vulnerabilities. A conflict or several concurrent crises are added on top of this. The humanitarian situation quickly escalates to a security risk. This narrative, this link between the stable climate and human development needed for security, this is the story that needs to be told more widely and more often. If we fail to reduce emissions and build our capacity to cope with these impacts, over the long term, climate change will result in more disruption, more instability, and more displacement as impacts only intensify. The world will be less secure, clearly. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the strong links between human and planetary health and proved that urgent and global action play a crucial role in handling risk and shocks. Similar actions must be done to urgently tackle climate change, as it is the most significant challenge humanity has ever faced. But it is also a significant opportunity for jobs, health, well-being, sustainable livelihoods. If we can emerge from the current crisis and make a sustainable recovery, we will make a future that is greener, cleaner, healthier, and safer for ourselves and future generations. Realizing these opportunities will take all parts of society, all sectors of the economy working together with a common purpose. So let me highlight some key elements to do so. First, governments must significantly and immediately boost their climate change ambition and be accountable for meeting their pledges under the 2050 Paris Agreement. We must slash emissions as soon as possible, 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050, and collectively strive for a 1.5 degree resilient future. There is no separate path, there is no alternate universe. This is what we must do. Long-term ambition is crucial, but so is the need for short-term results aligned with the long-term vision on mitigation, adaptation, and finance. National governments need to submit robust and ambitious plans, and providing support to developing countries is indispensable to ensure that all countries and all actors can contribute to keep that 1.5 degree goal within reach. However, we also need businesses throughout the world aligning their goals with the Paris Agreement, and cities and local communities ensuring a climate-safe and resilient future for our neighborhoods and our citizens. It means a deep transformation must take place in all facets of life and how we live, including energy, transportation, construction, production, supply chains, our relationships with the natural world, and much more. The central blueprints to protect people and the planet do exist. The 2015 Paris Agreement and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda are there. What we need is to complete the work remaining under each of these, deliver immediate action, and continually increase our ambition. The second necessary element is multilateralism. We like to say that climate change begins with one person working hard individually. That's true, but it cannot stop there. One person cannot do it alone, nor can one city alone or one nation. Climate change requires all sectors of society and levels of government from all nations working together towards, as we said at the beginning, a common purpose, a new form of inclusive multilateralism. Every policy decision, business decision, and decisions we take on a day-to-day basis as a citizen needs to be through a climate lens. We must leave no voice or solution behind. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone must be involved. Climate action has to respond to the expectations of our societies. This means ensuring all sectors of society are involved in discussions on tackling this global challenge in a spirit of radical collaboration. This also means members of the security community should be part of this unity purpose. Climate-related changes have impacts on security trainings, infrastructure, transportation, mission execution. Increased natural disasters would create bigger demand for support for humanitarian relief, and in some parts of the world, the defense forces act as the first responders in case of natural disasters. This is why I believe the security community must respond and integrate climate change fully into their defense strategies and policies through a number of ways. First, embracing the sustainable and green transition and adjusting infrastructure and logistical systems and supporting communities not only to reduce emissions, but also to improve their resilience to climate change impacts. Second, increasing research and analysis on the environmental risks, vulnerabilities, and impacts of its installations and operation on the environment and local communities, and ensuring that knowledge and understanding of climate change permeates all areas of the defense ministries. And lastly, ensure a whole of government approach is taken, collaborating with all ministries and governmental departments, whether they be transport, energy, finance, agriculture, and reaching out to peers in other countries to share lessons, best practices, and exchange ideas on how to accelerate implementation. The Paris Agreement is about collective goals. It is only by all of us working together that it can be realized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Grabert, for sharing those really important thoughts. We need to have efforts at the multilateral level to really be able to make the action collectively that we need for addressing climate change. And so your work is critical, and we're grateful to you for what you do. We look forward to questions from the audience for Mr. Grabert and the rest of our speakers. So just a reminder to please put them into the chat, and we will be saving some time at the end of this session to address your questions and to allow for more audience interaction with the speakers as well. Let's move on to our next speaker. I'm excited to introduce Professor Michael Klare. Michael Klare is a senior visiting fellow with the Arms Control Association and Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College. He is also the defense correspondent of The Nation magazine and author of numerous books, including a nicely titled, All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. We're so happy to have you joining us here today, Professor Klare. Professor Klare will speak about how security experts can help bridge the gap between believers and doubters, and on the need for adequate large-scale action on climate change. You'll see this as a recurring theme. And Professor Klare, I had the pleasure of interviewing for a media advisory event recently, and so I know the audience is in for a real treat. Over to you, Professor Klare.
Thank you so much, Sweta, for introducing me and for all the good work that you do on this issue. First, I want to congratulate the organizers of this important event for putting together such an impressive roster of speakers and for bringing together the topics of climate change and security and how we can address these together. These are very important topics, and the conference is just an extraordinary mix of speakers and events. And so I'm very impressed. I also want to say how honored I am to be on a panel with such distinguished other speakers, but especially Sherri Goodman. I hope she's listening. I wish she was listening, but I just want to say how important her work has been to my work on this topic. She really is a pioneer in this field, and it was great to listen to her earlier on. Now, there's a lot that I could say myself on the issues, on the links between climate change, global stresses and strains, and human security. But what I want to emphasize today is the need to frame the problem of climate change in a way that can overcome the divide between environmentalists and climate deniers. Now, I suspect that most of the people listening in today to this conference believe in the science of climate change and believe in the need for governments to play a leading role in stopping the advance of global warming through massive intervention in the economy, if that's what it takes, and which is what I believe, and I think many of us believe. But many of our fellow citizens, in fact, a very large number of our fellow citizens, do not believe in the science of climate change and reject the role of government in addressing it. This we may view as very unfortunate, but the fact of the matter is, without the support of a clear majority of our fellow citizens, we cannot pass the legislation needed to make meaningful action to halt climate change, which in fact, is the situation we face ourselves in today, at least in my country, where most legislation on climate change has been blocked for decades. So if we're to move forward on climate change action, we're going to have to find a way to bridge the gap between environmentalists and deniers, at least to some extent. Now, I wish this could be done by putting out more scientific data about the realities and perils of climate change. But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to work. We've done just about all of that we can. More science is not going to do the trick. The denialist perspective is largely sustained by ideological views that are purely, that make purely scientific arguments ineffective beyond a certain point. A problem, by the way, we're seeing with vaccines for the coronavirus. People are rejecting the science of the coronavirus. And the best way to breach the resistance to climate change, I believe, is to rely not on scientists to deliver the message, but on respected military officers to make national security, not environmentalism, the goal of the endeavor. I believe this, to start with, because many in the denialist camp are staunch Republicans who consider themselves dedicated patriots and admirers of the armed forces. They may not listen to a PhD in a tweed jacket, but they might listen to a general or an admiral in a full dress uniform. When they speak, moreover, our generals and admirals are not going to talk about ppms, parts per millions of carbon dioxide, or GHG concentrations, greenhouse gas concentrations, language which will make little impact on the denialists, but rather of threats to national security, another matter altogether. This constituency is highly attuned to the language of national security, and I think it is an important gateway to its consciousness. In fact, the US military and that of other NATO countries has been speaking for years about the national security implications of climate change, often very eloquently. You heard Sherri Goodman speak that way. They speak both of warming's role in generating chaos and conflict abroad and posing a threat to the homeland in terms of extreme storms and droughts and fires and so on. For the most part, however, their observations have largely been confined to specialized journals and conferences like this. And that's why I think it's so important that their research on climate change and its security implications deserves a wider attention. And I hope that this conference will succeed in bringing that research to wider attention. And I think national security approach resonates with a wider segment of the population in other ways. As major floods, storms, and wildfires become more frequent and destructive, we will be relying ever more frequently on the armed forces to provide emergency services of all sorts, what the military calls Defense Support of Civil Authorities, or DSCA. In 2017, for example, when 3 hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, Maria, struck the United States one after another, the US Department of Defense mobilized tens of thousands of military personnel to provide disaster relief in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico. These personnel rescued thousands of people from rooftops, provided millions of meals and water, and helped rebuild infrastructure. Clearly, our need for the military's help in such activities is bound to increase as warming advances. And this lesson is not going to be lost on those deniers who were so unfortunate as to be caught in these disasters. Another way in which climate change and national security is going to hit home is in the communities surrounding military bases. We all know that military bases in the East Coast of the United States and elsewhere in the world are at severe risk to climate change because of rising seas, extreme storms, and other severe effects of climate change. Well, the same thing is true of the communities surrounding those bases. Many of them inhabited by military personnel, retired officers, base workers, and these people typically vote Republican for the most part, and yet they're going to suffer the same effects, the severe effects that the bases do. And it turns out that there's a common cause between the communities and the bases to build resilience to climate change. And what we've seen in the United States is growing cooperation and solidarity between military bases and surrounding communities to get legislation passed to for greater military resilience to climate change. And in this way, it comes back to legislation. And I'll end with that. We've discovered in this country that the best way to get bipartisan support for legislation on climate change is to reframe it in a national security manner. If you raise climate change issues as an environmental issue, they wind up as a partisan issue. But if you address them as a national security issue, you can get bipartisan support for important legislation. And now with the Biden administration, we have even a better chance of making progress in this respect. So I will conclude by saying that it's essential that we bridge the divide between environmentalists and denialists on climate change if we're to achieve the concrete results we need in slowing global warming. And that it's essential, I believe, to frame the issue as a national security terms, so that everybody it senses how it affects them and how we have a common interest as people, as members of our nation, to address climate change together in a meaningful way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Klare. Thank you for bridging the gap really between believers and deniers, and also the military and the broader society. Your work is really critical, and I'm sure what you've presented today is going to spur some questions from the audience. But before we get to audience Q&A, we have one final speaker. Our final keynote this morning is Mr. James Bezan. Mr. Bezan is the Conservative Shadow Minister for National Defense and Vice Chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defense. A member of the House of Commons since 2004, he represents the riding of Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman. Between 2013 and 2015, Mr. Bezan was Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defense and was active on files dealing with military procurement, the war against ISIS, and Russia's aggression in the Ukraine. Welcome, Mr. Bezan. We are delighted to have you with us this morning. Please, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Sweta, and I want to thank you and Paul and the organizers for inviting me today as, I guess, the conservative voice on the panel today. And I can tell you that as Canada's conservatives, we're recognize climate change is real, that it has a huge impact on our lives. I'm quite proud of the climate change plan that Erin O'Toole recently announced, which for the first time in our policy put a price on carbon. And so I think that we're starting to move in the right direction. And you know, you mentioned I've been elected since 2004. I've been on the defense file for the past decade. But when I first got elected, I was on the agriculture committee. I chaired that committee for a couple of years, and then moved over to the Environment and Climate Change Standing Committee in the House of Commons and chaired that committee for 3 years. And so I kind of bring that unique background of being a conservationist in environmental action, as well as food production, tying in national security and threats to us as democracy-loving free nations that are going to be created and are being created by climate change. And we know that climate change and the relationship to human security is really about how the biophysical impacts of climate change are impacting our human well-being. Now, there's no doubt that as nations, we have to become very resilient. And because of our wealth in the West, makes us more capable of dealing with things such as requirements to build more infrastructure, doing disaster mitigation, making sure that we have sufficient health care, which we are witnessing right now being put to the test because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it also how it impacts upon our own supply chains and our, governance, and making sure that we have robust institutions that can handle these types of threats and challenges to our democracies. Now, climate change is definitely impacting regions differently. I can talk, specifically from my position here on the Canadian prairies, of how, a decade ago we were dealing with, severe flooding, billions of dollars lost around Lake Manitoba, and now building the infrastructure to mitigate future flooding events and making sure that we can handle it from Lake Manitoba and Lake Winnipeg. These are significantly large lakes, in the number 11 and number 13 in the world for size. But, we always talk about, impacts of flooding along coastlines, but it even is impacting us here on the prairies. And then, a decade later, we're sitting here dealing with wildfires and droughts and storms, and the impact that has on our national defense capabilities are something that we have to keep in mind because of what we're seeing, again, because of COVID-19, how much our militaries have been used to augment our healthcare systems, and in Canada here, including the delivery and rollout of vaccines. But at the same time, they still have requirements, what we call Operation Lennis, which is to provide that aid to civil power to ensure that our provinces can deal with things like flooding and wildfires and drought. And, there's an increasing demand, and we've seen that increase exponentially, especially over the past decade. And that's all related to climate change. Now, the cost of having that being dealt with by our military, increased cost to our provincial governments and territorial governments are something that we all have to keep in mind. But we also know that, building that protective infrastructure to mitigate against natural disaster are impacting our governments at all levels. But it's also impacting us as individuals, because we're also seeing our insurance rates go up for protection against flood and fire. I don't want to plow to the same field more than once, but we did talk about earlier that how this is impacting upon poorer nations, and how we're going to see more crop failures, and how that is going to lead to more famine and displacement and migration. And in countries where they do not have the same levels of governance, where they don't have strong institutions, they aren't going to be able to respond to crisis the same way that we can here in North America or in Europe. And so it becomes more important that we can be able to deal with things like human migration. As it's mentioned, climate change is a threat multiplier. And so what we've witnessed in the past, I don't believe climate change will create terrorism, but it does create a place for organizations like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others, Al-Shabaab, to find a place to operate, to find a place where they can radicalize our youth, and then use that as a way to create more stability for our nations, to require us to project power and have more needs on our alliances and our individual militaries to be able to deal with the threat that's created because of countries that are in despair, and essentially creates that environment where radicalization can take place. So we have to address this head on, and we know that the problems that we have today are going to be the problems that we have tomorrow, and so we have to address things like lowering emissions. We have to get to net zero, and there's going to be opportunities for us to do that, including within our militaries. So, we have to build our strong alliances that we're lucky in Canada that we have NORAD and we have NATO and we have the Five Eyes that allows us to protect ourselves collectively, to be that deterrent, to deal with, belligerents and those that are creating insecurity around the world. But there's also the need to insert ourselves to provide a more coordinated and humane interventions to ease the human suffering that we're seeing around the world. There's no question that, when I first got elected, 17 years ago, people were all talking about peak oil at the time. And I said, it's not peak oil we have to worry about, it's actually peak food. And there's no question that food, clean drinking water, the fisheries are under threat. And that is going to create the destabilizing factors that will allow, global terrorist organizations to find a stronghold. It'll cause more conflict and crisis within nations that are seeing increasing drought and tougher times to grow their own crops and food products. So, and there's no doubt that this will also impact upon the infrastructure of the Canadian Armed Forces and other militaries around the world, as already mentioned, whether it's coastal Navy bases, whether it's our infrastructure that we have in our bases and air bases and wings around the world. But we have to be able to make the investments to, one, make sure that we are moving to a net zero in our military operations, which includes biofuels. And, right now, one of the biggest users of diesel power, of course, are our navies, our armies, and then, of course, aviation fuel for our air forces. So I believe that, and Aaron O'Toole has said this as well as a former officer in the Royal Canadian Air Force, is that we need to be a leader in early adaptation of biofuels within the military, using domestically produced biofuels, which create a new marketplace. But there's always concern about the efficacy of in cold weather environments of biofuels. So Defense Research and Development Canada should be a leader in pushing the limits in developing and bringing to market new biofuels and other ways to power our bases around the world, so that it is clean energy and renewable. As mentioned, the aid to civil power, civil authority is going to put increasing demands upon our armed forces, and the international humanitarian relief that we do. In Canada, we have DART, domestic or disaster assistance response teams, being able to get them out there as quickly as possible. But that, again, is more demands on our militaries to do things to deal with climate change, and not necessarily looking at how other countries, especially the old great power rivalries, are trying to take advantage of our militaries dealing more with domestic and humanitarian issues, while they continue to have their own, in Russia's case, imperialistic views of expanding their sphere of influence. And so, we have to, from a Canadian perspective, and an American one as well, have to think about Arctic security, how our sovereignty is going to be challenged with melting sea ice, as already been mentioned, increasing transit, but also easier access to the running out of time, okay. But we have to be worried about Russia posturing in the Arctic, as well as China's interest in the Silk Polar Road. So thanks for that, Sweta, for cutting me off. I appreciate it.
all in fun though. This is important information, and you've put so much information forward that I know the audience is keen to get it on and to ask you more details about. So let's get into that. Thank you, James. Thank you to all of our speakers this morning. It's evident after listening to our speakers just how critical it is for us to address the risks of climate change, and especially how climate change serves as a threat amplifier to existing conflicts and tension around the world. Climate change, we know, doesn't respect arbitrary national borders. It doesn't stand in line at immigration. And the human and global security threat is really severe. And so regardless of which nation state we represent, we are all really in this together. Our speakers have underscored the urgent risk posed by our planet warming and the need we have to act more urgently as a global collective. So our alliances are more critical than ever to combat this new adversary, climate change. So let's get into the Q&A. We have about 6 minutes before we're going to begin to wrap things up and get into our next panel. We have a great day of content. And so we'll take questions from those of you, and we see many coming in. We're going to try to get to one question for each of the speakers, and we'll go in order. So we'll begin with the first question for Mr. Grabert. James, what are some mechanisms that can be used to hold governments and businesses accountable for their pledges to curb emissions?
Well, we have the standard mechanisms in our UNFCCC process in terms of the commitments to report information on the targets that you set for yourself, including detailed data in terms of the transparency around the emissions. And we're moving in a greater direction to do even better in terms of reporting on what you're doing in terms of support, particularly financial support to the developing countries. So that's a standard, general way we do it. But if you ask me what more could be done, I think it's, we just need governments to want to be as transparent as possible, and not for just the sake of being transparent, but for the sake of being an advocate for the issue itself. That's where the greatest value will become. And one way that we do that in our engagement work is work through, popular culture, work through the particularly targeting the youth, find the mechanisms that are the communication tools that would be helpful. And I think that's probably one of the most powerful ways. So if the government wants to make not only formal reporting and sticking to its ambition and commitments, it needs to also be seen as being an advocate out there to convince this. Someone was talking about the deniers as opposed to supporters, but there's a vast middle that needs to be better informed, and that will be the ones who take the action.
Thank you for those thoughts. I think they're pretty aligned to how Michael approaches some of these challenges as well. To build on what James was just saying, Michael, could you please talk to us about what would you say to a Republican here in the US about national security and how it's being impacted by climate change? What is the messaging?
I'd begin by asking that person where they live, and because where they live matters, and depending where in the United States they live, they are likely to be affected by climate change in different ways. And I'd ask them how their community was being affected. Do they live near a military base, for example? Have they experienced drought? Have they experienced extreme heat? Have they experienced flooding? And then I would talk about the ways in which the US military have been speaking about those impacts, and how the military has been saying if we don't tackle climate change, those impacts are going to become more extreme, and their communities, their lives, their families are going to be put at greater risk. And I would cite the work of the US military in speaking about these threats. The Department of Defense has published a report on base vulnerability, and it covers the entire country, Alaska and Hawaii as well, showing, and the bases are scattered everywhere in the United States, and they identify the vulnerabilities to those bases. Well, the surrounding communities are exposed to the very same areas. And I would say, don't you care about your vulnerability of your community to that? And isn't that part of the patriotism that you speak so deeply and proudly about? That's the way I would attempt to approach the matter.
That's great. That's really useful for many of us who are communicating to potentially those who are resistant to hearing this message, but in a way that can really reach those communities that might be more resistant or more even hostile to this message. So same question to you really, James Bezan. What would you say to a conservative voter about national security and how it's being impacted by climate change?
I think just to build on what Michael just said, it's the issue around the threat to our own national defense, our own national security, not just at individual bases across our countries. It's also about how it impacts on readiness. And I think in the minds of conservative voters is deployability, the threat that we are dealing with, and how we stay safe here at home. And so if our forces are spending more time dealing with humanitarian aid and disaster relief and fighting natural disasters in our own home countries, our deployability is going to be greatly undermined. Our ability to train so that we're ready for the conflicts that we're either currently engaged in or the ones that are going to be coming at us is going to be undermined because of troops being deployed in the issues of floods, wildfires, and providing humanitarian assistance to countries and populations in need. So, either we have to make our militaries much more robust and larger, but with the finite budgets that we're facing, becomes increasingly difficult. And so there is going to be the need to change the climate if we want to be able to deal with future conflict.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts. There are many more questions as you would expect from the audience, but unfortunately, we have come to the end of our session. I can't thank you enough, James, and Michael, for contributing your expertise, your deep knowledge, and clearly your passion for addressing climate change and the role of national security communities around the world to really come together and tackle this urgent issue that we all face as a global collective. Thank you so much for the work you do and the time that you have given us today at Climate SAN. Thank you to the audience for being engaged for this first session, kicking off these next 2 days. We have much more to come. We have representatives from the International Military Council on Climate and Security. We have speakers from the Center for Climate and Security in the next 2 upcoming sessions. So be sure to tune in, and please continue to share everything that you are hearing here through the hashtag ClimateSAN. We need to get this information out there. It's more critical than ever, and there's a role that we can all play in doing that. So thank you for your engagement, and thank you, sirs, for kicking off a fantastic event. Thank you.